Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I actually just want to make sure we are live on LinkedIn. Today we're going to be talking more about SOPs. We have with us again Abby Roth, who has been very gracious with her time and her knowledge talking about this. And one of the things I actually just asked Abby was what other things? Because I always want to, always asking what else we should do our podcast on. And she said, nope, SOPs keep coming up.
Yeah.
So why don't I let you start, Abby? Or you can start with introducing yourself again for those of you don't know, and then we'll jump into the topic.
Sure. So I'm Abby Roth. I'm the owner and microbiologist with Pure Microbiology. So I've worked in contract micro for the last 17-ish years, transitioned to doing more with sterile compounding, and really came more from a GMP background. So kind of have some of the knowledge base to be talking about quality systems, SOPs, and that kind of stuff. So.
Great. And of course, I want to remind everybody that if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat section. Happy to answer them. So let's pull up my first couple of questions. So why don't we start with what the difference is? And I remember we've touched upon this, and I've touched on it a couple of places, but the difference between a process and an SOP.
Sure. So when we think about like a process, usually we think of more kind of like the process flow diagram, like a really high level about how we go about generally doing something. And those can have value in an organization for sure, like trying to figure out what the process will be for something from start to finish, and making sure that you're including all of the steps that you need. When we really talk about SOPs, though, we're talking about the procedures that make that process potentially happen. So trying to ensure that we have standard operating like procedures. That's why we get the SOPs. So same thing happens every single time when we go to do things. And these are going to be in a whole lot more detail, really taking us through some more of the whys. Usually there's some policy information in there too when we think about what we see with sterile compounding pharmacies, because they had been referred to as policies and procedures. So it would have the why we do it in addition to having the how we would actually do those things.
So do you think it's important then for the staff to understand the why? Does that help in them going through and doing things correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think having some of the why and the scope of the SOP really kind of sets the stage for what that individual is going to read as they're going through that SOP, and then solidifies why those procedures are important to the process, important to the organization, important to patient safety.
So do you see a lot of SOPs that don't include the why?
Sometimes they kind of just turn into like a list of instructions as opposed to having the whys behind it. And also just kind of having like a general, this is our policy, like this is what we do, and then can include why it's done. And then later in the document, go into how to actually do everything.
Okay, great. So then what about an SOP and a work instruction?
Yeah, so some organizations like to take kind of things a step further. When you start writing an SOP on something that is really intense, like preparing like parenteral nutrition, having to put together a TPN bag, and everything that goes into like setting up that compounder, that's pretty intense. And it might make sense to have an SOP, but in conjunction with that, also have work instructions, which really pulls out into very specific detail how to do one component of that SOP. And having been involved with like writing SOPs when I worked at the lab, it was one of those things where if the employee pulled that SOP and it was like 20 pages long, they were like, I'm not interested in reading this. And then it kind of is like, are they really getting everything out of it that they need to? And so sometimes having accompanying work instructions make it a little bit more palatable to kind of get all of the information that's needed, because you can do it in some smaller chunks.
So wait, but the work instruction is not part of the SOP? Because for me, this is the first time I've heard of one.
Yeah, so it would go in combination with the SOP. So you have the SOP as the main document, and then you have work instructions, or some people will call them job aids, that go along with that SOP. So everything's going to have to be read, but when people kind of are able to break it down into, okay, well, I have 15 things, but they're only 1 page long, versus I have a, 25-page document to read, it just kind of mentally makes it a little bit easier to have them go through some of that information. But it's up to the organization.
Right. So it's kind of a cheat sheet?
It could be. And sometimes it'll still have a lot of information on it. But yeah, it's the thing that is with you as you are going through, and you can step by step go through to do what's needed.
Got it. And the other thing, the reason I ask is because now one of the big 483s is not properly following your SOPs. So how does the work? So the work instruction is not part of that, right? I mean, I know it's what you want to do, but it's not a technical. Is it a piece of paper that will be evaluated by the inspectors?
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to show them that information. So whether or not you consider it part of the SOP, it probably is going to be seen as like an attachment to the SOP, or sometimes we'll have forms in pharmacy that go along with the SOP, but it's not like in the SOP. So that would be something though, where the inspectors would still be looking at those work instructions and seeing whether or not they're being followed. So training and reading those and making sure that they're step-by-step going through ends up being really important. And some will turn work instructions into checklists, basically, so that if they're covering themselves as they're going through a process, and almost in a way checking off that they've done everything that they've needed to.
Okay. All right. Thanks. If an organization is starting from scratch, what would you say is the first step?
If you don't have any SOPs in place, and you're having to like draft everything, the most important thing actually is to get your format set up and what you're going to put in the SOP, the sections that it's going to have, and what it's all going to look like. Because really then the first SOP that you should write is that SOP on SOPs. And I think we talked about that the last time, that you have to have that really in place. But from there, it's kind of then looking at, the information that you're presenting, making sure that you're gathering all of the relevant stakeholders that need to be involved in drafting the information. And that's going to vary depending on what SOP you happen to be writing. Things that are more quality based are going to be probably handled mostly by your quality department. The operational SOPs are going to be people that are in the day-to-day and are going to be actually doing the work. They're going to likely the ones that are going to be kind of drafting, that version. But the biggest thing out of this is making sure then that as you do start drafting these, that your purpose is very clear in every SOP that you write. What is the scope? What are you trying to get out of it, so that whoever reads it knows?
So how many people actually do start from nothing? Because I know we also talked a little bit last time about purchasing SOPs and what you need to do once you've done that.
I think it really depends on what you're doing from, in this case, like a compounding standpoint. Hospitals are going to likely have kind of everything that they need in place. But if you're going to be a brand new kind of community compounding organization, you have the option of starting from scratch, or the option of purchasing templates to kind of get started. But even when you purchase those templates, they give you the format, but maybe there's tweaks that you want to make to those anyway, and you want to add another section or rearrange some things. So you still kind of have to really evaluate how you want your SOPs to look, even if you're purchasing them.
Well, that's what I was thinking, though. At least it provides you a preliminary. I mean, how many people like actually completely start from scratch, as opposed to at least templating, something that you buy and like you said, customizing it to your needs.
And that's kind of a mix. I mean, it's a lot easier to template it out for sure.
Unless you have lots of experience and you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Right. What are some of the things that they need to consider in the drafting of SOPs?
Um, that it's going to take probably way longer than you think it's going to take. It's going to take a lot of time to kind of get everything down, drafted, and then putting that SOP to kind of the test from the process standpoint. Does it include everything that you need? Have you covered all of your bases? Do you need to go deeper on a particular section with work instructions? And again, just being at the lab, like there'd be at least probably 3 people that reviewed an SOP. Now we were a smaller organization, but you had at least 2 people looking at it from technical content, and then you had somebody from the quality department reviewing it, that way. And one of the other things that it's, I think, really important to just keep in mind is that your SOPs all end up being like intertwined. So when you are designing and drafting and starting to write all of these, you have to make sure that what you've put in one jives with what you're putting in another one, because they kind of might overlap and go hand in hand. And that can sometimes be really difficult to make sure that you're not missing things like that.
Okay, thanks. And how should an organization approach revising existing SOPs?
Hopefully they have some kind of change control system in place already, that they have an SOP, a process that they follow when they're going to make a change. But this kind of goes back to what I had just mentioned of when you go to revise that SOP, how many other SOPs are going to be affected by the revision of that one? And again, back to my days, like quality, like director, it was a nightmare sometimes where things were so intertwined with each other that you were going back and checking multiple SOPs and the forms that went along with them. And then just having to make sure that you don't have to update other SOPs because you've decided to update this one. And it could be something like, you're changing, for us, it could have been a supply that we were changing, and that supply happened to be used in multiple SOPs. Well, that's kind of why you want to be careful when you're writing them, that you're not super specific with some of the information, especially like supplies, because if you put in one SOP that we're getting it from this manufacturer and then you can't get it from them anymore, every SOP that has that in it needs to be changed and updated. And that's also one thing, talking about the FDA and what they expect to see. Man, if you put in there that you are going to use this from this manufacturer and you can't get a hold of it, that could be a major problem, because now you're not following your SOPs. So you have to make sure that you're leaving yourself an out in the event you can't get a hold of a particular type of supply. And that sometimes just means keeping it really general. I totally went on a tangent there, Vivian, but
No, it's good.
That's one of the things that as you're writing, you have to keep those things in mind.
Yeah, I didn't even know it could be so specific as to identifying specific suppliers.
That came up in my past with, I think we got audited as the lab, and it was just one of our customers, thank goodness. But they were like, well, what are you going to do if you can't get a hold of this? And we're like, well, we can order it from wherever. And they're like, well, are you going to write a deviation because of that? And we're like, no, nobody wants to have to do unnecessary work. So we did end up making a lot of changes in our SOPs internally to accommodate for that.
So would you do something that, sorry, now I'm stuck on this tangent. Would you do something that kind of outlines the requirements of the supplier without naming a specific supplier?
Yeah, absolutely. You would go through and kind of design what you look for particular suppliers. You'd end up doing audits for those suppliers as well. So you're going to kind of be covered on that, just as long as your SOP like lays out the specific needs of a particular item. For us, a lot of it would maybe happen to be media. So, good one that I can use that everybody's familiar with is like, oh, we need TSA. Well, I'm not going to get involved that it's TSA from wherever. It's TSA, and we get it from where we need it. So.
All right. One more question, which I know you love. It's my favorite part. Story time. Tell us a story of something that went wrong and how it got fixed.
That's a good one. Let me see here. We ended up.
I don't know if anybody can hear that. Sorry.
Yeah, I can. I mean,
I don't know what's going on out there.
Yeah, this is. I mean, I know the one with the big one was for us was the supplier, but we had to go through like our ISO 17025 accreditation, and that really like tore apart our SOPs just because we had to put things in there that we hadn't had in our SOPs before, and really required almost a rewriting of a lot of our documents with adding additional sections. So anybody that would have any sort of need for an accreditation or some other kind of credentialing that you're looking for, be prepared for having to redo SOPs and updating them to meet needs for sure. Because that was a process. Like, it took us a long time to get everything updated. And if you kind of know that ahead of time going into something like that, it makes it a lot easier. So.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Last chance. Anybody? Any questions? I'm going to count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Abby. As always, great to have you. And I guess we'll talk about when our last and final session is on this topic.
Awesome.
All right. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too. Bye, everybody.
Bye.